house. You have to make a journey to a library or your local job centre to access your account, and you could be getting a message from your advisor every day, which means you have to travel every day, and that can be really cumbersome for people, particularly if they do have a disability and mobility is limited.
I'm sorry, I see you're actually called Gemma. It's just a water jug that's blocking out the G of your name from the angles. I do apologise. Thank you, that was very helpful. I remember seeing a statistic once from Scope which suggested that a surprisingly high proportion of disabled people were not online. Is that something that, that was done from a survey that they'd organised, is that something that reflects the experience of anyone on the panel, everyone on the panel?
Yes, I'm not familiar with the stats from the Scope survey, but Ofcom carried out a report. They published a report which found that 1 in 5 disabled people didn't have ready access to the internet, and that does vary among different groups. It's 2 in 5 when it comes to people with learning disabilities, for example, which Gemma has touched upon. So there are specific groups for whom that face digital exclusion, and certain groups that will require support to do things online, and that's across a range of things, whether it's banking, registering to vote, and then of course making the UC application, but then also maintaining the logbook, which is done online as well. So particularly if we're thinking about people with learning disabilities, for example, that might need support from a family member, carer or support worker, that's going to be absolutely critical, so that if you're lucky enough to have that support, then you might be able to complete that application. But of course, if you don't have that support, then you're reliant on either contacting the UC helpline and then completing it for you, or going to a third sector agency that might be able to help you.
Thanks, Rob. And Daphne, and how do you, feel free to comment on the question I've just asked, but also how do you think it could be made easier for disabled people to make claims online?
Well, if I do the first bit first, if that's all right. So, I fully support everything they've said. Certainly with things like sort of assistive technology, a lot of people can't necessarily afford that themselves. The job centres, generally the computers don't have any screen readers or anything like that. They're bog standard computers, so even if they went to the job centre, and I think that's often the case with libraries, they don't have the technology to enable people with disabilities, certain disabilities like sensory loss, whatever, to use them.
That's a really important point for us, Daphne, because as you know, we've done quite a lot of work on assistive technology, so and I don't think anyone's previously highlighted that very important, obvious point that you've made, that computers in job centres often don't have those necessary.
I think occasionally
themselves.
Flagship ones might have one or at most two, but really that's in what I've had feedback via operational stakeholders. Somebody said,
Daphne, where's one of these flagships? So that
London Bridge was the one I think that was one of the first ones to go on the new sort of all singing, dancing computers and open plan and everything. And I sit on the operational stakeholders forum. I remember when that happened, and one of the questions we asked, well, how many of the computers have got assistive technology? And they went, oh. And it was like, they hadn't thought about it. I don't know. That was 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know whether they have now improved
we'll ask
it.
A question on it. It's really important, isn't it? Yes, thank you.
The other thing that somebody brought up, who works with people with sensory loss, is sometimes the BSL links aren't that easy to understand. There's quite a lot of regional variation in BSL, and that's an issue. And not only with the BSL links on the computer system, but also with interpreters. The DWP will only use the big word, and often the interpreters come from a long way away, rather than using the local interpreters. And again, because of the regional variations with BSL, that can be really difficult for people to understand and communicate effectively. I've got quite a long list here, sorry, but I'll just add a few other things. Home visits, although DWP are doing home visits for people who can't get out or access a computer, they're going and helping them with the online claim. It's only the claim, it's not the managing the claim afterwards, so they'll get them set up, but then that's it. Certain advisors in London are telling me now that it's getting harder to get a home visit as more go on to universal credit. And we've got to remember we're still really low numbers. I think for the 870,000 on universal credit, maybe only about half a full service, and only a small proportion of them will be vulnerable, so it's only going to get more. So that's an issue, that whether they can meet the demand. It's also taking longer to get a home visit to see somebody, so that delays the claims. Obviously, until they've collected all the information, that the payment can't be made, and that leads to a longer delay for people, which can be difficult to manage. Phone claims, there's quite a reluctance to accept phone claims. If you try and make a phone claim, you tend to get pushed towards going into the job centre, which I think one of you two said sometimes it's not very accessible. There might be quite a distance, travel might be an issue. So all these, they could make phone claims more accessible, would be one of my answers to your second point. Terminal illness,
Skype ever work for that?
It depends, possibly for some people who can manage Skype,
Just
yes.
different options for different people, just to...
Yeah, I mean, yes, sometimes
FaceTime.
that's really effective for people. It just depends again on how digital literate they are. I mean, and just on that digital literacy, I mean, with universal support, obviously the support to get help elsewhere. For example, one advisor told me you can get digital support between 2 and 4 on a Thursday in their area. Well, do you know, that's a bit of a tight window for people, isn't it? And, you know, but that literally is what they can get. And that's for a whole sort of area. And, you know, how many people they can help in 2 hours. It's really quite limited.
Can you just pause on that?
Sorry, I've got a lot of things.
Regularly in this about what was the original vision for universal support and what is being offered now.
Well, I think the image initially, I know Croydon did quite a lot, it's one of the sort of first areas, and they were finding initially that it was working quite well. Job Centre were referring people through, but very quickly they just didn't have the resources. And I've heard from Taunton as well, similar experiences, that they had some quite good both digital and budgeting support set up, but it just wasn't enough to support. And, you know, there was still the small numbers, and that's, I think, the real fear for welfare rights advisors, is that support isn't there.
Whilst you're on the subject of universal support, at the moment, obviously, it's just looking at debt and IT. But if the resourcing issue could be addressed, what other issues would you like to see dealt with by a universal support package?
I mean, well, that's interesting. We're just on the spirit of the moment. I mean, debt and IT are the main things, but it's just to a much higher level. I mean, there were some people who are never going to be able to manage an online claim. I've had learning difficulties is perhaps a classic one. In fact, I had somebody who works for Macmillan giving me a case study, works a couple, and both with sort of mild learning difficulties, and then the woman had breast cancer, had to give up her job, and they just failed for months to make a universal credit claim. They just couldn't do it. They tried, and they finally got picked up by the Macmillan advisor who helped them. But then they couldn't manage the online, couldn't do it. They kept trying, and then they'd press the wrong button. They didn't understand what they were meant to do.
So universal support could be offering, in an ideal way, could be offering that sort of assistance to make sure that people didn't.
That's right.
Seek the support of third-party organisations to...
That's right. I mean, they were going back to the Macmillan advisor every time. Unfortunately, she was able to do it, and they were lucky to have her. But it was quite high resource for her, you know, and obviously limits time with other people. And, you know, it can take quite a long time. Sorry.
Do you see in all cases that there is partnership work going on and that there's co-location of other services in job centres, or is it more sporadic? Because that's certainly something that we've had raised at previous evidence sessions. If we can have that one-stop shop, it's much more effective. So is that...
It's definitely working well in some areas, that, you know, where they've got somebody in the job centre and there is really good sort of together working, But again, it's about resources, because they're finding it tight, you know, like there's more people coming on, and that's the worry about whether the resources will be there. Again.
Can I, Gemma and Rob, do you want to comment on this? About the universal service?
Yeah, I think it's important to also acknowledge that I know the government's committed to digital by default, but digital by default can't be default for everyone. As Daphne has highlighted, not everyone can use the online system. It's very hard to make the universal credit online system accessible for and put in plain English for people with learning disabilities. So there does need to be some workarounds as well for people who are struggling. And I would completely agree with Daphne that there needs to be more resources and more support available for people who are struggling with the online system as well.
Gemma, when you say there needs to be more work on, how do we begin to shape that as a recommendation?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question,
Well,
please?
you said there needs to be more work done. in this area. Can you be more precise? Because we're always thinking about how can we translate ideas into recommendations.
Well, when you design like a website and online system, you do user journeys. And I know DWP have done user journeys for universal credit, but I think they need to take into consideration that not everybody can use the system that they've designed. So how would you design working and co-producing with disabled people who are struggling to use the online system? How could you design a workaround that works for everyone, and not making it more cumbersome for work coaches so there's 100 different versions of the system? But I think that co-production and making sure disabled people's voices are heard is really important.
Have all three of you offered to DWP to work with them to make these changes and improvements?
Yeah, Sure Trust has. We've fed back on...
All right, fine, you have. Rob?
Yes, we have. So we've had members from the Universal Credit team to come to the Disability Benefits Consortium and talk to, in that forum with the different charities around how to make the application process and logging into your logbook as accessible as possible.
And the results?
Well, they've always said that they are listening and taking on board these things. But I think there is more... I guess it's two things. There's more to be done to make the process as accessible as possible, whether that's ensuring it's screen reader ready, ensuring there's easy read information available for people with learning disabilities, and so on. But then, as Gemma and Daphne have said, there's always going to be people for whom online is not going to work. So should the government be looking at resourcing third sector agencies to support people through, or should it be looking at doing that through universal support?
Daphne, on that quickly.
I think there has to be an option for paper claim and the paper letters. There will be some people who cannot manage online, and I accept the government want digital for me, and for loads of people it works really well, the digital system. So, people who can manage it, that's fine. But there are some people, taken a long time to learn to manage letters and everything, and to learn a whole new system is too much. And I just think for reasonable adjustments, it should be a paper thing.
Right. Jack, are you happy before I go back to Alex with that? Right, Alex? All right, Ruth?
Okay, thank you. And at the start of someone's claim, obviously they're often waiting for a work capability assessment, and their work coach in the meantime has to impose work conditionality on them. How's that actually working in practice? Do you want to start?
They don't have to impose conditionality on them. Regulation 99 gives them an
yeah.
opportunity to lift it completely, and they can apply easements. But it isn't happening in reality. Not saying in all cases, but certainly advisors are seeing one where it's not. One case come in where they claimed in November 16. And the trouble is, while they're waiting for that assessment, it can take a long time for them to do that assessment. They didn't do the assessment till a year later, till November 2017, when they were put in the support group. But for a whole year, well, for the first 10 months, they were having full conditionality put on them, and until the advisor got involved, and then they got it lifted. Another one had 17 sanctions over 12 months. 17. It was just and they just couldn't understand. Their diagnosis was delusional disorder, which the work coach had no knowledge of. Fair enough, they're not medical experts. I think there's a huge expectation to put on the work coaches, and there's all sorts of skills they need, like empathy, listening skills, understanding. But the two big things that they don't have is they don't have time, and they don't have privacy. So the average work coach interview is 10 minutes. I think that was in a parliamentary question. I appreciate some will be longer. But in the NAO report that just came out, the workload of work coaches currently is 83, and they expect it to be 373 by 2024-25. 373 clients on their books. How can they possibly offer time? I mean, as a welfare rights advisor...
Sorry,
I'm talking too much.
Rob and then Gemma. So everybody will get a good...
Yes, just to echo what Daphne's saying, we're finding instances where these interim claimant commitments, how it should work is that you should be sitting down with the work coach and talking through what might be reasonable for you to do in the time frame, how many applications you should be putting in, etc., etc. And instead, we've had cases where people have been presented with a generic claimant commitment and sort of said, well, you need to really agree this in order to progress your application, and then people agreeing that and not necessarily understanding what they're signing up to, and then being sanctioned following that.
Gemma?
So we don't work with people that early on in the claim, but all we can do is share our experience and work programme where people with health problems, and you could be claiming job seekers allowance and have been allocated into that group after your work capability assessment, or claiming employment support allowance. And the people that were mandated to work programme who felt that they did not agree with the work capability assessment result, they spent their time obviously wanting to fight that decision. They're not focused on trying to find work, but also because they saw Sure Trust as part of that system, because they're mandated to us, it eroded the trust between our advisors and that individual, and therefore then it was a real struggle. And as Daphne says, work coaches don't have enough time to build that relationship and try and regain that trust. So with the conditionality, if it is imposed at that stage, our advice would be don't, because I can't see how it would really support people moving into work, because they're just focused on getting the right benefit for them.
Okay, thank you. So you're seeing a considerable number of sanctions placed on people before they've had a capability assessment. Is that?
I think that's the thing, is, and even if there's not sanctions, the stress that's put on people, it's overwhelming. And also it's impossible for the work coach to really work with the claimant until they know what their condition is. They go into this first appointment, they've no idea what their diagnosis is, what their health condition are. It's extremely hard for a person to go into the job centre, busy, pace, sit down in an open plan thing and talk about their health problems, which the work coach has no knowledge of, and they've got to present it all and get it across to them. It's almost like an impossible ask. And until that information's through to the work coach, they shouldn't be putting that pressure on the claimant.
Rosie, you want to come in on this?
Thank you. Daphne mentioned about this, obviously it's a kind of open plan office, and we visited an office. We were assured this time last week by the Minister, that there was the possibility of screens for privacy, because these people are talking about extremely personal and private conditions with someone you've said isn't necessarily familiar with them. Are you saying that you're finding that isn't the case?
Well, I'm not sure screens is enough. What we've been told is they can ask for a private room, but there's no signs up saying, if you want a room in private, please ask for one. And they're not encouraged, nobody's asked if they want a private room. And again, you've got people who are really vulnerable to go and say, excuse me, I want a private room. You have to be quite assertive, and it should be there. At the very least, there should be posters up saying, if you want a room, let me. If the work coach picks up that they're distressed, vulnerable, then they should say, look, can we make an appointment in a private room? And you wouldn't want to get out all your innermost things when there's people listening, particularly if you've got paranoia or anything, but even if you haven't.
Rob?
Just to add to that as well, I think an important point is around are people well supported at these appointments with work coaches as well? And if you have someone with a learning disability, perhaps autism, perhaps mental health, for example, and they don't have someone to support them at that conversation, then the work coach should really be questioning why that is, and perhaps rearranging that so that there's appropriate support there. Otherwise, they might end up with a claim commitment that's inappropriate.
Gemma?
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. There needs to be access to private space, because it's not just talking about health conditions. A lot of people we work with, have housing issues, debt issues. That's not the easiest thing to talk about. So feeling comfortable and having the appropriate time to talk to someone about that is really important.
Thank you. Could I ask, are you seeing any flexibilities being modelled into claimant commitments then? I mean, I think we've asked a bit, you've answered a little bit on that there's just not time to go into it. But we've got the generic 6 categories. Are you seeing any sort of flexibility to take account of disability in general in the commitments?
I think coming back to the resource point again is that we're not seeing those flexibilities across the board. We've seen some good examples, we've seen some bad examples, and the department's own research, which the NAO highlighted, and our quote from that says, work coaches lack the time and ability to identify claimants who needed additional support. They lack the confidence to apply processes flexibly and make appropriate adjustments, and felt overwhelmed by the volume of claimants reporting health problems. And I think if we think about, there are over 2 million people in receipt of ESA at the moment, so that's a huge number that will soon be going through the managed migration process. And if they're feeling overwhelmed by what to them is a relatively new cohort at the moment, they're used to dealing with single non-disabled people without dependents, there's going to be a huge number of complex cases coming to them, so their ability to apply bespoke arrangements to everyone is going to be very limited unless it's resourced appropriately.
Okay, thank you.
I think you can get the easements. For example, the guy with the 17 sanctions, the advisor got involved, and I think you're going to ask about this, but the advisor knew about the existence of disability employment advisors, but there's no clear referral process through to them. The claimants don't know about them. And in fact, what the advisor had to do this time, he had to get the partnership liaison officer involved, the office manager involved, and then the DEA did get involved. And he said once he got involved, it was good. They brought in changes to the claimant commitment. That was really helpful. They weren't able to do anything about the sanctions that had happened, unfortunately, although they were quite shocked at the number of sanctions there were. So I think it is possible, but it's not easy, and that's what it should be. And as I say, for people waiting for the work capability assessment, there just shouldn't be conditionality. It should just be about support, until we know where we are. But, for anybody, they just need to have time to listen to the claimant and for the claimant to get their point across. And then, like you were saying, the confidence. And I think that is about confidence to say, yeah, we can say, let's lift this for the moment. Let's just worry about your housing at the minute. Let's worry about your debt issues. And forget about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, sorry.
Yes, we've had a slightly different perspective, because once people refer to work and health programme, we do our own assessments, and where we feel that, and we don't see a copy of the claimant commitments, we're very reliant on individuals telling us about their own claimant commitments, but where we've seen that we don't necessarily agree with what they've recommended, we have had some positive conversations with work coaches about trying to make changes. I'd say that those changes aren't routinely applied, but we have been able to make easements to people's claimant commitments in some situations.
Okay. Finally, could I just ask if the same issues have been arising with people who've been refused ESA and have had to go on to universal credit because they're going through an appeal process for ESA?
Can we start with you, Gemma?
Yes. Have you seen conditionality imposed in those circumstances?
From our experience, once somebody's been seen to fit for work, yes, the conditionality is imposed, and that's when I just spoke earlier about the easements, and when we've made those assessments, it's generally for that group of individuals who have been found fit for work and actually still have health conditions and still need support to manage those.
Well, Rob?
I don't have much to add.
No.
Got a side of what Gemma said, so that's people who failed the work capability assessment. But if somebody, for example, on ESA has moved into a universal credit full service area, so they still have their limited capability for work status, what we're finding is they move on to UC and that status isn't carried through, which it should be under the regulations, and they're being sent for work capability assessment and conditionality applied. And the trouble is, we've done quite a lot of work on this and been in correspondence with Neil Cooling.
Good luck.
Yes, well, exactly. So what it is, it's a manual process, because the claim form doesn't ask were you on ESA. So the universal credit person has to send a form called an MGP1 form through to ESA, who then fill in what group they were in, and then that has to come back to UC. They have to input it into the computer in order for it all to happen smoothly. Now, not surprisingly, that's not always happening. It's better than it was. It was appalling. Neil Cooling thinks it's now resolved, but despite our telling him that it isn't fully resolved, it isn't. This is one where they should have the status there, and it shouldn't be an issue, but they're still having the problems.
All right,
and it's just not being picked up.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I want to ask a question essentially on the DWP's Disability Employment Advisor model, and whether you believe that that's working well for claimants and work coaches, or whether it could be better. Maybe start with you, Rob.
So disability employment advisors play a second-line role in the new system, in that they don't interact directly with claimants as we understand it. They provide support to the work coaches. I think the first point is around resourcing of DEA. So we don't we don't have the latest data on the numbers of DEAs, but we think it could be as little as 1 or 2 per job centre. So that would suggest that there's a limited impact that that person can do in terms of supporting work coaches. I mean, what disabled people continually tell us is that whenever they interact with the benefit system, they talk to people on the whole that they feel don't understand their disability, they don't understand their impairment, they don't understand the types of support they need, the right agencies to be referred to, and therefore they don't have faith in the system. So for us, we don't think that they are playing a role that's tackling that. And for us, it's very much about how do you build specialism into the system so that disabled people feel that when they are talking to someone, they're talking to someone that has an understanding about their condition, about their impairment. So whether that is, if you have a mental health condition, you're seeing a work coach that has an understanding about mental health, or you have more disability employment advisors that are specialists working much more closely and effectively with work coaches. So that for us is something that really needs to be tackled.
Gemma?
I think in our experience there's definitely some room for improvement in that system. When we've got individuals being referred to a work and health programme, we're still tackling health conditions which should have really been picked up or dealt with at job centre. Like we're registering people for GPs, we're getting them access to IAP, so intensive access to psychological therapy services and mental health support. And I think Rob picked on the point about that specialism and expertise of disability employment advisors. So we have a similar setup for work and health. We have health and wellbeing team that provides additional support to our support managers, but also can support the participant as well. But those people are qualified occupational therapists, they're psychologists, and they work part-time for us, and then part-time are still doing in clinical practice, so they've got the latest qualifications, latest up-to-date information and latest links to the local area. And we're finding that model working really well because, as Rob said, those people have got an understanding of the health conditions, and if there is something they don't understand and they can't give special support to, they know someone that can give that support. And though DEAs have more specialism than the average work coach, they're still not clinical experts in various conditions. So I think unless that more expertise is put into the system, that DEA model is not going to effectively support work coaches who really do need a bit more guidance and support and resources to do their job well.
I agree that there should be specialist work coaches, which I know something the committee's recommended before. I think, for example, mental health or learning disability or something like that. And I also think there needs to be a clear referral process through to the DEAs. As I said, that it's not happening, that people don't know about them, so they don't know how to use them, and that doesn't help. But I think Gemma's point about more specialists would be great as well.
Thank you, it's very helpful.
Yeah, hi, this is mostly to Gemma really. What early data is there from the work and health programme? I mean, are you getting the kind of numbers of referrals that you expected?
So in terms of the specific statistics, until the statistics are published in September, I can't make a specific reference to them, but I can talk about what trends we're seeing. So in terms of referrals, in the initial stage of being lower than expected, our referral profile's 12 months, so we're working very hard with Job Centre Plus to get that back up to where it is, and that's been promising. But I think the reasons why it's lower than expected so far is partly because of universal credit rollout in some areas. That is taking up work coach time. People are maxed out in capacity, so they don't have time to learn about work and health programme and the referral process to it. And I think also it's a new system and it's just taken a little while to embed it. So we're working with Job Centre Plus work coaches, so we're doing job shadowing in some areas of the country so they can see what work and health programme is. We're going to district team meetings to really market provision to work coaches, and we've invited them to our centres to see what we're doing there as well. So that has helped to start increasing referral numbers. So we hope by the end of the year and the end of the 12-month period it should be what we expected. In terms of job outcomes, actually it's been quite positive so far. We're sort of on target to where we thought we would be. So with Work and Health Programme, you get a job outcome if you meet an earnings threshold. So it's the equivalent of 16 hours a week for 3 months, but we've got up to 21 months to work with an individual to get to that point, so you could build up your hours gradually. And we'd model that people would be starting on probably entry-level jobs and then progressing their careers and increasing their earnings. But actually, I think the voluntary nature of the programme, because 88% of referrals are on a voluntary basis, means that actually we've got more time to work with people. Some of the fear about moving into work is taken away. And one of the positive bits about universal credit is with this system, because you don't have to, if you are on universal credit, if you need to leave work because that job's not right for you, or if hours need to change, you don't have to change your benefit. It's sort of, in theory, done with you for the job centre. So we're finding more people are going into higher paid work to begin with and work that's more suited to them. So that's an initial phase of something positive we're taking from it.
Okay, thank you. So what effect has the scaling down of the work programme had on the caseload and workload of work coaches, do you think?
It has definitely increased the caseloads of work coaches. And so work programme is for obviously some people with health conditions, but also long-term unemployed people who, if they've been out of work for 12 months, could be referred to it. Now, the part of work and health programme for long-term unemployed people, you can only access it if you've been out of work for 2 years, and it's about 12% of our caseload. So there's not many places for a work coach if somebody needs that additional support, unless they've got a really good local support offer in the area, such as things purchasing, dynamic purchasing system. There's not very much they can refer those individuals to, so the caseloads are increasing.
Okay, thank you.
Justin, to you, and then we'll start questions.
A broader point on this. If I was a claimant and I'd been referred, what tangible difference would I now see under the Work and Health Programme in terms of the support that you're allowed to give me?
In comparison to what, could you expand on that question a bit, please?
So as I've now been referred, you get me 12 weeks, different programmes. Do you feel that's sufficient support?
So for Work and Health Programme, the support we offer and how it differs from, I guess, Job Centre is, our advisors have an average caseload of 1 to 40, so they're able to give a lot more one-to-one support and time to those individuals. We have regular contact, and that is based on each person's own preference with our support managers. And our support manager's role is not just to give that one-to-one support for building your CV, finding the right jobs, talking to employers, but it's to refer you to whatever support you need in your local area. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment getting people into appropriate housing, tackling debt and finance, which is a really big problem at the moment, as I say, and the wraparound health and wellbeing support. And then in our hubs as well, you can access a wraparound health and wellbeing offer. So we offer things like Tai Chi, yoga, Pilates, walking clubs. We've also got a knitting group. And I think when we piloted this approach in our community hubs pilot in 2014 in work programme, there's a lot of scepticism about that wraparound health and wellbeing support, but what it does is it gets people engaged, it gets them wanting to come into our centres and talk to advisors, it gets them friends and builds that peer support, and that helps them get the confidence to move into work. And then another big difference is the in-work support we do, supporting employers. We do a lot to tackle myths around employing disabled people, a lot of support around job carving and making sure job roles are appropriate. For example, we've had a young man with a learning disability who was referred to us from Job Centre, and his work coach said, I can't do anything more with him, I don't think I can get him a job. So he was referred to us, and he didn't have a CV, he'd never worked, so we helped address that, and we found out his hobby and his interest was classic cars, so we got him some work experience with a local classic cars firm, and we did a lot of support because they were really nervous and taking somebody with Asperger's syndrome on, because they were like, what happens if something happens and we can't cope? So our work coach was and our support manager even was there on the work trial, and basically they were so impressed with his encyclopedic knowledge of classic cars and the support we gave them to cope that they've now offered him a permanent job which is supporting and which is starting this month. So I think that wraparound support for the individual and the employer is the big difference.
Now, work coaches, and I've done countless visits, speak very highly of both what you do and Plus and the other similar organisations who can provide that more in-depth support that you've just described. But when I was a minister, I remember work coaches' biggest frustration was they were limited to the number of referrals, and it was almost a case of whoever got into the office first and made the first phone call at 9 o'clock in the morning got the one place that was available. So why do you think referrals are now falling? Because before there was a much greater demand than you were allowed to supply.
And we would say that, the demand's still there. We know you can refer to from a signposting organisation to Job Centre Plus, and then that people can come to work and health programme. Whereas on Work Choice before, you could, if you're a signposting organisation, you could refer directly to us, and then we'd be able to take you on board. And we know that those people that, it's like early access group, like ex-services personnel, are not coming through. Yeah. So the reason why we think is as I said, capacity about universal credit rollout. In some areas, the work coaches don't have time to go through the referral system to work and health programme. It's quite a long system. There's a gatekeeper and a decision maker. It's quite bureaucratic. And secondly, it's just training and being aware that they exist. Work and health programme is a sixth of the size of the previous programmes. It's tiny. There's other local provision there that we're in competition with, and which might be more appropriate for some people. So it's just, we have to make sure we're marketing ourselves and making sure that work coaches are aware of what we do and know that it can be an appropriate solution for some people they're working with.
So, Rob, I'd always had great pleasure working with you with your policy hat on, because you would come in, brilliant suggestions, and help shape what we do. One of my big worries, and I was at Plus, so sorry Gemma, the other team, on Friday to do a visit, and you both do the very best you can within the rules that you can, but I'm not convinced it's how you would design the support available. From your perspective or with your members, my big worry is that even where people are referred, it isn't always necessarily the right support, so people end up looping in the system. And each time they loop and then they're referred back because they haven't been able to find work, and that could be 1 hour a week, which could be a huge achievement for somebody, to full-time work, their confidence is bashed a little bit more, and they move further and further away from the jobs market. From all your research, would you change the support that's available, and if so, how?
Yes, I'll speak with my Mencap hat on about our experience and not necessarily the members. So we've delivered employment services for many years. We've supported about 2,000 people with learning disabilities into paid work over the last 5 years, including work choice contracts.
Because it's a great achievement for Mencap, but 2,000 in 5 years. Mm-hmm. What do you think the demand is for your services?
Well, huge. If there's 1 million people with learning disabilities of working age in the UK, the majority of which wish to work, then it's a tiny figure in comparison to the amount that want to work.
What you're making. Sorry about this.
So we've taken the issue. We've taken the decision as an organisation not to engage in the health and work programme because for us as an organisation, we don't think it's flexible enough for us to deliver. So instead what we're doing is focusing on other areas where we think we can make the support work, and in particular what we call our 3 ships model: apprenticeships, traineeships and supported internships, and in particular testing the Paul Maynard task force recommendations about flexibilities around apprenticeships. So we're very much focused on that work. If we were to design the system, for us, what we know working with employers is they want to take on people with learning disabilities. They don't know how to, and they need the support to do that. So the focus of our employment support is upfront with employers, giving them skills, tools, knowledge, helping them make their recruitment processes accessible, training their staff in learning disability awareness, and then a place and train model with support fading.
So the key bit there is you've already sourced the employers. You've given them the confidence and the skills, particularly the small businesses that don't have HR departments. Then you match the individual, because I think the bit that the job centre misses out on, they'll refer people to organisations like yourself who equip people ready, but there aren't enough vacancies, interviews, placements, opportunities available. And I think the job centres need to be far more proactive at sourcing those employers. All the big major ones, your Tesco's and Marks and Spencer's, brilliant, they're signed up, but they're only a finite number. And I think that's where it is, because then your groups can concentrate on getting them ready, and then it removes that looping problem.
But also the figures, doesn't it, Justin? Of overall we're concerned about reducing the disability employment gap, and you're talking about thousands, and the national figure we're talking in millions. And therefore, when we come to our recommendations, we've clearly got to think of how do we add to the existing model with resources for people like the organisations we've interviewed on this, to them to have a much more strategic role in delivering this, because otherwise we're going to do nothing, aren't we, Justin?
That's right.
On this. And now Alex wants to come in, because I've stopped people's thought process. Can Alex come in and then we come back to you, Justin?
What maybe briefly, Rob, I think you just said that the health and work programme didn't offer you the flexibilities that you would need to run it yourself. Is that right? What flexibilities would you need to see in the health and work programme for you to take it to become a partner in it?
Yeah, and I should add that I think it does work for some people, the new health and work programme. That for our client group, we had to take the decision as an organisation that it wasn't flexible for us. That's specifically for us, as I was saying in response to Justin's question. It's about working up front with employers to prepare them for that person coming into the workforce. So that means that we have to have that money up front in order to do that. So under work choice, when it started out, for example, you could get 70% of your money up front in order to work with to place that person. That was reduced as work choice went on, and now under the new health and work programme, that's down to 30%, and you get the rest of your money after that person has earned a salary of £3,000, which might actually take quite a long time if you're only working a couple of hours a week. So it's an issue for the provider, if you like, and how we operate, and I would suggest that it's less of an issue for larger providers and a big issue for smaller providers.
Just specifically on this point, would it not be better that there was an individual within the job centre who proactively drove around doorstep businesses and found opportunities and then passed them to the relevant support organisation? So if it was somebody and you were helping people with a learning disability and they said, well, we could potentially, then they match them, rather than each of you having to go to, in effect, the same businesses. Surely it would be better that there was a role there within the job centre to go and source those opportunities externally.
I think that's a really interesting suggestion. I mean, it's sort of doing a bit what we do, but on a larger scale. Yeah. So we will go to organisations that don't have readily available, perhaps suitable roles for people with learning disabilities, and we'll say, what's your business model? How do you work? Well, actually, could that role that you're recruiting for, that might actually be suitable for someone with a learning disability? So to try to create the vacancies, if you like, as well. So.
Daphne?
I haven't got so much experience on the sort of supporting the workhouse. It's more about making the claims and managing the claims.
All right, great. Can we just bring together some of the thoughts for how we're going to make recommendations? I mean, we've obviously got the key, from the work coach. It's a key. We've always, praised this. We've always built it up in our report. But the people I know doing this role, the 10-minute rule is quite a hard and fast rule in how much time they can spend with claimants. So there's that question what we've got to raise, isn't there, in our reports? I tried to apply for universal credit, but my half an hour was up before I got terribly far with it. But if I'd had, say, I couldn't read very well, somebody helping me, would they put that on my report, my claim, so that the work coach would know that I'd got some difficulties in participating fully?
I don't believe there's space to put that. I mean, that's the trouble. The claim doesn't give space for anything like that. Another thing it doesn't give space for is the appointee's address.
Yes.
And it will only accept, once an email address is on the system, it won't accept another one, so there's huge problems with appointees.
So could you actually think about all these as we're going along, come back to us to refine these ideas for us? And then there's the issue, which Rosie and Justin have raised. Here you are giving specialist services, but the amount that you can give is tiny compared with what the work coaches might like to draw upon. And we've had this example of who's in the office first, making the first phone call, actually might get the place. It's as crude as that in allocation. And because we can't jump to what the ultimate we'd love to be, could you think for us and then come back, what are the steps by which we can consistently increase the support that you've been talking about and which Justin has been visiting and also trying to nurture, so that each 6 months we know that the department is making progress on using a pool of talent that work coaches can refer to. Is that all right? Really good and helpful. Thank you very, very much. But we might come back and talk to you by correspondence more as we build up our report.
Can I mention one very sort of terminal illness really needs addressing? There's no fast tracking for terminal illness like there is under PIP and ESA. Somebody can't make the claim on their behalf. Terminal illness needs addressing really importantly in universal credit.
And the motor neurone
will
disease.
you also, when you come back again, emphasise the points which Jack raised about how universal is the universal support? And so that we don't just keep stamping on people, but encourage people saying, can you tell us where it's really working well in your experience, so that we can actually say to the department, can you keep trying to match this standard?
We'll just give you a nice list of recommendations then.
Yes, no, these are all our recommendations, yes? Huge thanks on behalf of the whole committee. Could you begin our inquiry by, this session of our inquiry, by introducing yourself, and then we'll go down the...
Of course. I'm Sam Royston. I'm Policy Director at the Children's Society. I was also one of the authors of the Holes in the Safety Net report a few years back on the impact of universal credit on disabled people and their families.
I'm Afzal Rahman. I'm a Senior Policy Researcher at Citizens Advice. At Citizens Advice, we helped last year 2.6 million people. Over 2/5 of those were disabled people and people with health conditions. And disability benefits continue to be our biggest advice area as a service.
Yeah. Very good.
Good morning. My name's Dan Norris. I work for the Child Poverty Action Group, where I run a service called the Early Warning System, which seeks to understand and evaluate the impact of post-2013 welfare reforms.
Brilliant. Special welcome, if I may. Jack?
Thank you, Chair. So firstly, we want to just ask a few questions about the impact on disabled students. So I wonder if you could add your thoughts about the impact of universal credit on disabled students.
One of the main issues that we've seen at CPAG raised to us by advisors in the field is the difficulty that universal credit, or disabled students wishing to claim means-tested subsistence benefits, and universal credit in this instance, have in becoming eligible for universal credit. Universal credit largely excludes students in full-time advanced education on the basis that they are in receipt of education. There are some exceptions, which include disabled students who have a limited capability for work and an entitlement to a disability benefit such as personal independence payments or disability living allowance. Under the old system, under an employment and support allowance, a claimant could be treated as having a limited capability for work before they underwent a DWP work capability assessment on the basis that they were supplying a medical certificate from their GP to cover the period until the DWP arranged a work capability assessment. Under universal credit, that provision isn't available. Some people can be treated as having a limited capability for work, but it doesn't include the provision that a person supplying a medical certificate can be so treated. And that means that claimants, disabled students who are claiming universal credit in a full service area either have to wait a period before they can get any universal credit support once they've been assessed to have a limited capability for work, or are having their applications refused because at the outset of the claim, prior to having a limited work capability assessment, they haven't got a limited capability for work and therefore fall to be excluded from universal credit on the basis that they don't reach the sufficient thresholds to allow to claim.
Have you got any views on that?
It's not an area that we have done policy work on, but we have seen people dealing with it. I think the main issue for disabled people is that the system is simple to navigate, so we see things like this where it's not clear where responsibility for making sure things work lies. This is falling between two posts. And similar things on free school meals and medical evidence, and it leads to design problems. So more joined up thinking is probably needed in this area, and it can't be claimants that lose out.
DWP have suggested that other entitlements such as the disabled student allowance and other student-specific loans are why that, as you suggested, students aren't entitled to universal credit. Do you feel that they cover the full costs that disabled students may?
I think that explanation for the current situation, where many first-time universal credit claimants who are also disabled students are unable to get their entitlement, I think it poses a problem, because it means there are sort of two classes of disabled student: those who already have a limited capability for work because they've had an assessment under universal credit, or they had an assessment under ESA prior to being transferred to universal credit, are entitled to receive UC to top up their student finance provision. The suggestion that the other groups, those disabled students who can't get universal credit because they don't have or initially don't have a limited capability for work, can rely simply on the student system or the student finance system. If the suggestion is that the student finance system is amended or beefed up to take account of the requirements of disabled students, that would have some positives, in the sense that the students wouldn't be relying on the social security system with associated stigma. But at the moment, it doesn't have that. There are disabled student allowances, but those are course specific, so they're issues around they're paid in order to support a disabled student to pursue their course. The universal credit entitlement allows for the student to get means-tested support by virtue of the fact that they're disabled and face extra expenses. So no, I don't think that the student finance system, as it currently stands, can replace the entitlement, the top-ups available under universal credit. They're simply not. They don't account for the circumstances and the specific needs of those disabled students adequately.
But what you are saying is that it might not necessarily be for DWP, it could be through, as you say, the students' finance system to improve, to address some of these issues.
That's certainly a possibility, and as I say, there are certain advantages to that. The disabled students that are pursuing education are doing so to not be workless, not be dependent on the social security system, and they avoid the stigma of being benefit dependent, and some of the problems of difficulties claiming and maintaining a UC claim have been addressed by in the earlier session. I think the obvious problem with that approach is that there's already in universal credit and the Department of Work and Pensions the resources and the structure to assess somebody's disability. So we have the work capability assessment, and it also assesses their means and their needs, so it can do a means tested calculation. If we were to move that provision over to the student finance system, that would seem to imply that you need to replicate that assessment process to find out how disabled a person was, whether they had a limited capability for work or whatever the equivalents might be called under the student system. It would seem to me to just require replicating a whole system again in another department, which might not be willing to do so, and it entails a great deal of inefficiency, I guess, that universal credit is set out in one of its aims to avoid.
Do you think any other further improvements could be made to help support disabled students?
I think we talked. The panel earlier on talked about the issues around accessing the universal credit and maintaining a claim, and I would echo all of those problems there. Problems we've seen on the Child Poverty Action Group whilst I've worked there. I think the return of some of the disability premiums, which I think we'll probably discuss later this morning, would further support students who are often some of the most disabled and the most vulnerable, in that they live alone if they're entitled to the severe disability premium, the enhanced disability premium. And they are taking what are probably the only reasonable steps available to them to find employment. So I think an increase in support by the return of the premiums would go some way to support those students.
Can I be clear? Are you saying that the assessment of the disability should be universal credits? Even if additional payments are made, they should be through student finance. I'm just conscious. Quite a lot of my students, which is a straightforward application of the student support, they don't get it easily. I'm adding this complication in.
And I thought, so forgive me, I thought the trigger in the legacy system was if you're on PIP or DLA.
You've got.
So why can't that be the same flag for the education, for the student loans, or if it's coming to the education budget rather than DWP?
One great, fairly straightforward improvement would be to amend the universal credit regulation so that a person who is in receipt of a student who is in receipt of disability living allowance or personal independence payments and was undertaking a course of education, undergraduate degree, could be treated as having a limited capability for work until their work capability assessment was completed, so that they would be allowed to make and continue a claim, receive universal credit top-ups to their student finance support until a work capability assessment was completed, and it could be decided whether or not they had a limited capability for work.
Can we stay with you, Heidi?
Yeah, although I can't help but feel that's still going around in circles a bit. This is about somebody who's in education.
Agreed.
So then it is going back to sort of Jack's probing, is it for the DWP to provide that top-up, or is it for an alternative mechanism? The scenario you've described feels a little bit like going around in circles. It shouldn't be about capability for work. You're a student. So if in the old system PIP or DLA was a flag, PIP can still be the flag. But then, ultimately it's all government money, it's all taxpayers' money, isn't it? But it pops out in the student loans budget rather than the DWP, which I think is what DWP are pushing for.
And that's what you're pushing for, Daniel. You're to keep as many people off universal credit as possible.
Universal credit?
Yes. Even if the designation for the additional payments comes through DWP.
Yeah. Under the old system, you have to have a limited capability for work. The advantage of the old, and in addition to receiving PIP or DLA, the advantage under the old system is that you could be treated as having a limited capability of work by production of a medical certificate. That's not available under universal credit. That's where the problem lies. I don't think I have I think there are positives to supplying all of the payments or support for disabled students through the education department, as I say, stigma being one of them, not having the difficulties of claiming universal credit. I think the downside of taking that approach is that the existing student financial system doesn't have a particularly sophisticated or all-encompassing assessment of disability for the small amounts of disability additional support that's available through the education department. The DWP has already got this procedure in place through work capability assessments and assessment by third-party private organisations. It would seem to me that if you want to continue that assessment, you could do that under the Department of Work and Pensions and make the payments under the Education Department. But to be honest with you, I think it matters less.
Hasn't PIP been done and gone? If the person's got PIP, then that's the flag. You don't need another assessment. Or am I missing something here?
At the moment, to be entitled to universal credit as a student, you have to both receive PIP and a limited capability for work. In fact, that was the case under the legacy benefit system. So it's not PIP alone. I think to make extra support available for students through the student finance system, if they have PIP, would reduce the requirement and would be a more generous offer to disabled students. So yeah, I think I'd be in favour of that.
And that's an easy kind
that would be an easier
no
solution. It would expand the number of people who are entitled to the help, because at the moment it would take away the extra threshold that you have a limited capability for work. That has cost implications, but I think it would be money well spent.
Okay.
Afzal?
Like I said, we haven't done policy work in this area, so
Very good. Sam? All right, back. More general points.
Brilliant. So, in fact, Daniel, you hinted to this sort of next topic, which is because this whole inquiry today is about how is life like, what is life like for disabled people in the new world of universal credit compared to the legacy system. And one of the biggest changes is the removal of severe and enhanced disability payments. I'd like you all just to give me sort of your general views on what that means for disabled people and their carers, families, because it's often the extension of the family and not just the person themselves. But also in light of the announcement that's come out of DWP on the 7th of June, I think it was, about this transitional protection. Talk me through how far that gets us to where we need to be and whether there are still flaws in the future state, I suppose, for disabled people. Should we start with you, Sam?
Yeah, sure. So I think the removal of the severe disability premium within universal credit is one of possibly the biggest mistake in the transition to the new system. It's an awful lot of money, is the first thing to say. The SDP is worth an extra £64 a week. It's paid to severely disabled adults who do not have a non-disabled person to look after them. So neither a non-disabled partner in the household nor another person receiving carers allowance to look after them. On top of that, the EDP, the Enhanced Disability Premium, is effectively paid to people in the support group for ESA. It's worth £16 for single people, £24 per week for couples. Under universal credit, as you say, both of them being scrapped altogether. However, it is worth pointing out that the support component equivalent within universal credit has been substantially increased. So there's a £38 a week increase in the level of the what's now called the limited capability for work and work-related activity component, but I think I'll just call it the support component. The greatest loss is for people who don't receive that additional top-up, the extra £38 a week. So people who'd be in the work-related activity group effectively for ESA at the moment. However, one thing that is really important is that even people in the support group face a substantial loss as a result of the removal of the SDP.
Of it, isn't it?
So once you take into account the loss of the SDP and the EDP and you offset that against the increase in the value of the support component, people in the support group are worse off by around £180 a month. And in fact, we'll come on to the transitional arrangements in a moment, but I think that there's an error in the draft regulations because they suggest they'll be worse off by £80 a month rather than £180 a month.
We're typing error the wrong way, couldn't it?
Well, who knows? But it's certainly something that we'll be very keen to get resolved very quickly. The Children's Society are particularly concerned about the impact of this on two groups in particular that we do work with. One is disabled parents with young carers. And the reason for that is that this would normally be single parents with a disability, with a young person in the household. Now, because the young person can't receive carers allowance, and we think rightly can't receive carers allowance if they're under 18, then the parent can receive the severe disability premium. And that additional support is absolutely crucial for enabling them to pay for private care services, people to come in to do housework, somebody to come in and help with the garden, all of those things which reduce the care burden on the child and enable them to participate in the normal activities that a child should be involved in, make sure that they're able to be involved in their education, etc. The other group that we are very concerned about is young disabled people making a first move into independent living. Now, the reason for this is that they're actually affected by a number of changes to their ESA simultaneously as a result of the introduction of universal credit. So if you had a 23-year-old claimant in the mid-rate care group for the standard daily living component for 4 PIP with limited capability for work. Under ESA, they would currently receive a personal allowance of £73 a week, so they receive the over 25 rate of personal allowance rather than the under 25 rate because they're on ESA. They'd receive a work-related activity component of £29 a week, assuming they claim before April 2017, and the SDP of £64 a week. So their overall ESA entitlement would be around £166 a week. Under universal credit, their total ESA entitlement is £58 a week in exactly the same circumstance. And that's because they've lost the work-related activity component, they're moved from the older person's rate of personal allowance from £73 a week down to £58 a week, and they lose the severe disability premium. So a cut in their overall ESA entitlement of 2/3. And I just don't know how you cope in that situation.
So the 7th of June, the announcement, patches over that a little bit?
It certainly helps. The announcement is, enormously welcome. It broadly falls into 3 parts. Firstly, preventing most people receiving severe disability premium from transitioning onto universal credit. Secondly, changing the transitional payment arrangements a little bit to make sure to reduce the circumstances under which those can be lost.
Because it's back pay as well, isn't it, for anybody that's already in this situation?
And then thirdly, introducing this additional payment, transitional top-up payment for those losing the SDP and back paying that to the point where they first moved on to universal credit. But broadly, there are 4 really big problems with the transitional provisions that have been introduced. The first is what I think and hope is an error in the draft regulations, which provides for an additional top-up of £80 a month for those with limited capability for work-related activity. So say that seems to leave them about £100 a month short.
Number 2?
The second is that there are circumstances under which people can lose the transitional protection still. So, for example, very strangely, it appears that if they're a couple where both partners receive the severe disability premium, now that would be if you've got 2 disabled partners, if they separate, then they lose their SDP protection, which I don't understand at all. Thirdly, there'll be circumstances under which people can migrate to universal credit when they're not entitled to the SDP, but then if they were later to come into entitlement to the SDP, then they wouldn't get it. So, for example, if you've got an 18-year-old with a disabled parent that's migrated onto universal credit, the disabled parent wouldn't receive SDP at that point, and so when the young person moves out of the household, they wouldn't get the SDP back and they wouldn't get any additional protections. And fourthly, of course, the measures fail to address the long-term impact of the loss of the SDP. So for new claimants, they won't get the SDP in the future. So the long-term impact of this change remains the same.
That's brilliant. But so we can get our list together, Afzal, what would you add to that list, please?
So I would echo the concerns about the £80 top-up that's been suggested in the regs.
What we'd love, Afzal, any new ones?
You'd love new ones.
Is there anything extra that Sam hasn't covered? Because he is clearly quite geeky and knowledgeable on this.
So people can lose their transitional protection if their circumstances change and then they change back. So if somebody was to be on ESA with the SDP, was to move into work, not on the SDP anymore, they lose that transitional protection. If they were then to be dismissed from work and move back onto out of work benefits, they would have to claim UC. There'd be no.
It's that change in circumstance, isn't it? As you say, either 2 people splitting up, in and out of work. It's anything that rocks the boat and makes you a new UC applicant.
And we also know that the SDP isn't the only way that disabled people can lose out on moving onto UC. So it's really welcome that the government has announced these changes, and it's reassuring the government has continued to make changes for disabled people as they move on to universal credit. But there are other groups. Sam talked about people who were in the RAG group losing the RAG and the enhanced disability premium. They won't be protected And that specific combination of disability premiums, they'll end up with just a standard element on UC.
Yeah.
They won't be protected because the protections are only for people on the SDP. Similar combinations for people on JSA, and then there are broader groups such as disabled workers. So disabled workers would have got the disabled workers element in tax credits. If they transition onto universal credit, it's quite likely that they have no additional recognition of working with a disability in the system, something that has always existed in tax credits. That's worth about £3,000 a year. Again, similar in amount to the SDP, and then there are other groups such as people on permitted work. So it's great that we're looking to protect disabled people, looking to see what we can do, but there's more that we need to identify.
It feels to Daniel, is it a correct assessment that it fixes those who have been on it and are moving on to, or will be moved on to UC, or have been moved on to UC, where nothing in their lives will change, but one little disruption, then that transitional protection, they lose it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, echoing all the points that have been made, I think it's important to see this in context, particularly that transitional protection only protects those currently getting the financial support. Those that are becoming disabled at the moment or are going to make a claim are going to lose out. These are the most disabled people in our community. They are also quintessentially isolated. They live without another able-bodied adult, and that responsibility falls on their children. Any question of, or can fall on their children in a caring responsibility, any question of cost has got to be seen within the context of the fact that it will produce knock-on effects for the well-being and education of their children, of the people the claimant concerns mental and physical health. And it should also, as has been alluded to, be seen in the context of other cuts that universal credit embody, such as the reduced support for lone parents who are under 25, freezing of many elements of universal credit, and the loss of the limited capability for work. So it's not an isolated cut, if you so to mean.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we have to think about where people face cumulative losses, where some of those cuts come together for a person. And if it's not just if they receive the SDP, that covers some of the people with some of the greatest losses, but there are other combinations that you can come against where you've lost entitlement to different things that are not recognised in UC, and there isn't the tailoring available within the new system for those cumulative surpluses.
Can I ask one final little question? It's a little bit provocative, but do you think the announcement, any of you, do you think the announcement on the 7th of June was an acknowledgement of the new Secretary of State realising, you know what, we can't, this isn't right, we've dropped the ball here and we need to fix it? Because it's incredibly welcome, because up until that point I had certainly felt like nobody knew about SDP and EDP. It's like suddenly they do. And it's good news that they're attempting to fix it, but we need to encourage them to go further. Would that be?
Yeah, it's really reassuring that the government has acknowledged this problem, acknowledged that there are disabled people who face losses in universal credit. It's a big step forward,
but it's just not everything.
I think the only time will tell, really. I think that it's a very hopeful step forward. In some ways, the biggest indication that they want to do something, the government would like to do something longer term, is that not only have they enhanced transitional protections, but are paying this top up as well, that they recognise that actually there is this group of SDP claimants who are going to be left considerably worse off, and as a result they're going to introduce an additional element, effectively an additional element within their universal credit entitlement. But I think we've just got to see, really, and very much hope that they do something which permanently improves the universal credit for this group.
Okay. Please.
Thank you. I'm quite interested in what the impact of the loss of SDP will have on people's ability to live independently, and then what knock-on costs that could have, and far greater costs on the social care system. Have any of you got a comment particularly around maybe young disabled people who are looking to move into independent living, and what impact the changes will have on them?
My experience when I worked at Foodbank until I took this role on at CPAG as an advisor there, and we saw, it was in Tower Hamlets, and universal credit was rolled out over 18 months ago. The loss of the SDP was paying under people's legacy benefit claims for effectively things like the shortfall between the help that was available under housing benefit and their actual rent liability, which is to an extent a widening gap. So it stabilises people's homes. It stabilises their children's homes. There's been with the loss of council tax benefit and the introduction of localised council tax reduction schemes, many of those are less generous, and it enables those people to pay their new or post-2013 council tax liability. I think that it clearly, from my experience at the food bank, it clearly adds a great deal of pressure to the shoulders of people who are often disabled and lone parents living alone, and therefore entitled to the SDP, and that feeds through, that affects all of the members of the family inevitably. I think it's almost undoubtedly the case that if if the parents have less of an ability to cater for their own care needs, that those care needs will fall on their children, and their children's welfare will suffer as a result, and that has a cost implication, as well as a wider social implication for those kids.
Afzal?
So people who get the SDP currently may use it to pay for some care, cover some expenses of people who come to help them, maybe their family. So they may, losing that support, they may need to rely more on those people and have less money to cover those needs. On the point about young disabled people, not having the SDP there disincentivises them from taking steps towards their independence. And universal credit is all about moving people forward. And if we're put in a situation where if somebody does want to move out, live alone, become more independent, that support, that financial support isn't there for them when they do that. That is a stop right in the sand for them.
Well, as I say, with regard to young people living independently, under 25s with severe disabilities could see their ESA cut by effectively 2/3 under universal credit, and I just don't know how you could cope with that level of reduction. When we published the Holes in Safety Net report, we did a survey of disabled people in different circumstances as part of that. And broadly, the costs that people talked about fell into kind of housework that they spent the SDP on, fell into housework, shopping, help with cooking, help with personal care, gardening, and just other costs. There are so many just different bits and pieces that you face if you don't have a carer to look after you. People talked about very simple tasks like just collecting post from the shed. One person said that they opening parcels, recycling the packaging from that parcel, putting the rubbish out. Even those simple tasks like that, if you don't have a partner to provide those care needs for you, or you don't have somebody receiving carers allowance to do it, then you need to effectively either not do them or find some way to pay for somebody to do them for you. The group that I mentioned we are particularly concerned about is this group of single parents with young carers, and in our survey around 40% of those who would be affected, single parents affected by the loss of the SDP, had children spending more than 15 hours a week assisting their parents already. 70% of households with at least one child over 10 had support from them for over 10 hours a week, and they were already really concerned about the social exclusion of their children as a result of this. So one person said, my local authority no longer provides home care and I need to pay them for personal care. My son cannot cope with school and my needs and care for the home as well. His likelihood of obtaining his hires this year are nil. His whole future has been ruined because of our circumstance. This is the circumstance which people are already in. If they lose the SDP as well and those additional care needs are passed on to their child, it's going to make life nigh on impossible.
Sam, how many groups where we've got young carers does the Children's Society work with?
How many
groups around the country do the Children's Society support who are the key person in the whole household is the young carer?
I can't give you the number exactly off the top of my head. It is some number. We provide through the Include service a lot of kind of networking for young carers as well. A lot of our support goes directly to the young carer rather than support for the parents as well. So, for example, just last weekend, actually, we held a Young Carers Festival, a national festival for young carers, to give them the kind of opportunity to come together and have a bit of a kind of leisure time and an outlet where they can experience some kind of social activities and interact with other young people with caring responsibilities as well. And some thousands of young carers came to that.
Brilliant. Because we're thinking all the time, sorry Ruth, about a report. Could you give us some, I know you've got your own, could you give us some up-to-date examples of what this just means if you're a young person in a household where whether you've slipped into it or whether it can never be a free decision for a 10-year-old to take on these roles, but what it actually means and what the difference is with the different levels of financial support.
Well,
you've got it in there, but you've just had a big festival. Did you get any more up-to-date information for us?
We did actually ask young people about their experiences of benefits. We're collating the evidence.
That for our report.
Yeah, we're collating the evidence from that at the moment. I don't have it to hand, but I'm sure we'll be able to pass some of that on.
In our report, and if we can do it from the Children's Society, it'd be brilliant.
Yeah, of course, I'm sure we can do that.
Ruth?
Thank you. Can I just clarify one point? You said that ESA would fall by about 2/3 for people, young disabled adults moving into independent living. What would they have been on before in terms of that ESA, and what's it dropping down to?
So this is if they're on the standard rate care component of standard rate daily living component of PIP. If they're on the higher rate, it should be said that it would be lower, or if they're in the support group, it'd be lower. But currently, they would receive £73 personal allowance for their ESA, £29, assuming they claimed before April 2017, £29 work-related activity component, and £64 top up through their severe disability premium. In total, it comes to about £166 per week.
Right, and that will drop by 2/3
down
to
drops.
about 50 or 60.
That drops down to £58 a week, so the lower rate of standard allowance within effectively the young person's rate of standard allowance within universal credit is all of the equivalent support that they would get. Now, they would get some additional support both in the current system and in the new system, some additional support through, say, DLA, through housing benefit. Those are not included within that, but their ESA entitlement cut by around 2/3.
Thank you. Well, we've heard a lot about how the system is going to impact on disabled people. Do each of you have any recommendations for ways of offsetting the removal, particularly of the premiums, for those who are most adversely affected? And what's the sort of cost implications for this? Have you got any proposals for us, Daniel?
I think our proposal would be that they're restored. Obviously, and there have been suggestions of other sort of less financially costly to the state solutions to the problem. I think in terms of what it will cost, well, it's what it's currently costing, because most people are still getting. There's a relatively few people, especially who would qualify for STPs on universal credit. So for most people, the cuts have yet to come. So we're not talking about an extra expense rather than offsetting a cut. And I think if you're going to consider the cost to the exchequer of continuing to pay STP or coming up with some sort of amelioration, an alternative, what needs to be considered is the cost on other services, social services, the National Health Service, education, even the Criminal Justice Service, making this cut. This is, as I say, to some of the most vulnerable people in the community, and I don't think it's a particularly contentious point to say that will have a knock-on effect on other budgets. So it's not as much as what it will cost, but what it will save.
Trouble is, Daniel, the government won't listen to that argument. Whatever the political colour of the government, of course they should, but they don't.
Yeah.
So what we'd love, if you can't do it now, but we obviously invite everybody to contribute to this, if you can think in the language of universal credit, how we might actually add to the universal credit arrangement, support, whatever we're thinking about, so the government doesn't have to climb down, but we actually get some movement. And therefore, in a sense, it feels like a natural progression, development of universal credit, rather than saying, oi, we want to hoik back something which the government clearly now regards as going into the past. Could you help, but Afzal, you might also have some, without the new name, what about Ruth's question?
So I think an immediate concern, thinking just before the long term, is that the people who have already moved on to universal credit are and will benefit from the protection that the government's just announced are identified quickly, those 4,000 people, and the correct payments are in place for those people. So Sam mentioned that the regs mention an £80 top-up for those in the support group who get the enhanced disability premium and the severe disability premium. That needs to be closer to £180. So we need to get that right first. And then in the longer term, I think our position remains the same. So Sam talked about the Holes in the Safety Net report, and that was co-authored with Citizens Advice. Our position remains similar to what we suggested then. We suggested introducing a self-care element, and this would be done in the way that elements work in universal credit, things like the carers element. It would have advantages over the way the severe disability premium worked in the past, because it would it would maintain the work incentives and prevent the cliff edges that universal credit's design is meant to do. You could introduce a self-care element that is set at the same level as the carers element to ensure parity between people who have a carer that lives with them and those who don't. That's about £156 a month. And that remains our position, and we're broadly in that space.
Sam, do you have people who've been, I think Afzal's been telling us what you're going to say. Is there something more specific you've got in mind for us, please?
So just to build on that suggestion around the self-care element, it's actually very welcome what the government have done with the carer element within universal credit, in particular removing the earnings limit, which means that if you've got a carer in the household, they can both work and provide the care responsibilities which they do, and you can continue to receive some additional support as a result of that. But that just,
as you would expect with a young child, you'd expect them still to go to school and provide the care, wouldn't you?
Well, indeed, although you wouldn't receive that carer element if you've got a child in the household.
We nevertheless expect these,
absolutely.
You may have other roles to carry out, but we still expect you to care.
Yeah.
Or allow you to care.
But you're quite right. But the additional support that has been very welcome in that area has actually increased the cliff edge between a circumstance where there is a carer in the household and when there isn't a carer in the household. So suppose you've got a family with a couple, two parents, one severely disabled and a child in the household, and say one of the non-disabled partner is providing care for the partner, but also in full-time work. When that circumstance, the household both receives a carer element within their universal credit entitlement, gets the full-time earnings from the person in employment, and has the additional care support for the disabled partner. If that partner then moves out of the household, they not only lose the full-time care support, but they also lose the carer element, and they don't get any replication for a self-care element. So the bare minimum, it would seem, which would be sensible to do, would be to say, well, in that circumstance, where you're providing that care, effectively a parent is or other disabled person is providing that care for themselves, then they're given the same amount of support, financial support as you would provide to a carer for looking after them, so that they can purchase that care in for themselves. And
Sam, can we? I'm conscious of time. That's a really good high note to end on, because it's also one which I think the public could see the sense of if we actually recommend that. So I'm immensely grateful for all three of you coming and adding to our list of proposals. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But before we go, Alex, we're still in session. Can we?